This is a baby, and this is what would happen to him if his parents died in the 1800s. He would disappear. Not only that, but thousands upon thousands of other orphans would disappear too. How? Well, it's simple, really. Someone would just take him. If a child lost both parents during the 1800s, he would become the property of the state. The government would then put him up for adoption. But there was a problem. There were thousands of children who had lost their parents due to the Industrial Revolution, and not nearly enough homes for all of them. So when an adoption agency couldn't find a family for him, they would simply bring him to a factory to work. And it wasn't just adoption agencies either. Factory owners would set up their own adoption networks to get poor kids working for them. Once a child was taken, they would be stripped of their old life. They would change their name, their age, everything, and then they would vanish into the sprawling complex of the factory where they would work 12 hours a day for 6 days a week for pennies a day. But why didn't anyone save them? Well, because no one even knew they existed. That's because every child who disappeared into a Victorian factory was effectively erased from existence. Their old name would be forgotten. Their family wouldn't know where they are, or even that they were alive. They would be too ashamed to tell anyone they worked in a factory. And even if they did try to escape, no one would believe them. After all, what could be more believable than a child who was well-dressed, well-fed, and living in a nice home? No one wanted to believe that these kids were actually working in terrible conditions for next to nothing. And it's not like people didn't know that these factories existed. These were massive complexes that took up entire city blocks. They were just so desperate for workers that no one thought twice about where those workers came from. It was also very difficult to investigate what was happening inside these factories. For one thing, it was illegal to be under 10 years old and working, so the children themselves would lie about their age. Then there was the sheer number of children working in these factories. There were around 1.5 million children working in factories in Great Britain alone. Many of them were too young to even be working at all, let alone working in such dangerous conditions. So it's understandable that some people tried to look into this, like Lord Ashley, a member of the British Parliament, who visited a mill in 1839 and found that it was filled with children as young as 8 years old. He tried to get the government to do something about it, but they refused, saying that if these children were being abused, then someone would have noticed. Of course, that was wrong. People did notice. A writer for the Times wrote about how she saw children working in a Manchester factory, and how she heard them singing songs about how they wished they were dead. Another writer recalled seeing the pale faces of children at a Birmingham factory looking out of the window, having never seen the sun. But despite these accounts, nothing was done. It wasn't until 1842 that an inquiry was finally launched into the working conditions of children in factories, and while it did lead to some reforms, it wasn't enough. Children were still working in these factories for the next 100 years, and many of them would never see the outside world again. It's easy to think that the worst of the Victorian era was the extreme wealth and the extreme poverty. But to me, the saddest part of the Victorian era is that there were so many children who just disappeared. They disappeared into the smokestacks of the factories, where they would spend the rest of their lives working for pennies a day. Thank you for watching. If you want to learn more about what life was like in the 1800s, stay tuned for more content.